Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some more services to our Docker Compose. The first one is going to be a database. For this, you can use MongoDB, Postgres, or any database you want, really. I like to use Postgres, so that's what I'm going to go with. So I'm going to call it Postgres, like so. And then the image that I'm going to be using is Postgres 15.4 Alpine. And you can kind of see the Postgres versions on the Docker Hub reference here. So you can see that this is the Postgres image, and these are all the supported versions. I'll be using this one here. Okay, so once we've done that, we want to restart always if there's an error. Then we want to add some environments. We can add the Postgres user, Postgres password. For now, locally, these can just be the same or whatever you choose. We'll add some ports in, and this is usually on 5432, so we'll just keep it at that, and then we'll add in the volumes to store the database information. So we're going to store it under PostgreSQL data. Okay, so once we've added the Postgres, we're then going to add another one for Redis. So the image that we want to use is Redis. And then we want to restart unless stopped. Logging, we'll do none. This is just so that when we run our Docker Compose, it's not going to be just filled with tons of Redis logs, because right now we're only going to be using this as a pub sub, so we don't really need to see too many logs here. We're going to add the Redis ports in, and these are normally under 6379, so we'll keep it at that. Then we're going to add a command because we want to run the Redis server, find Redis port. Yep, that all looks good. And then last but not least, we're going to add volumes, which is just going to be under Redis. Okay, so now that we have this, next time we run Docker, so let's just make sure Docker is open on our desktop and it's started up. Okay, so now that it's started up, we'll go back to the code and we'll run Docker compose build. Okay, so what this is saying is that it refers to an undefined volume. So right down here, what we want to do is we want to define some volumes. So let's type in volumes. And for cache, for the Redis one, we want to have the driver as local. And for DB, we want the driver to be local too. Okay, so that's defined the volume, so that should now work. Another thing that I'm going to do while I'm here is I'm just going to make the main API depend on the other services, Postgres and Redis, because we want to make sure that they're running before this is running, because otherwise our database connections and stuff just won't work. So now that we've added that, let's do Docker compose build again, and that should build that. Okay, so now once that's been built, we'll do Docker compose up, and this will bring up our service. It'll pull the database image, it'll pull the Redis image, and it will run those in the background, and we'll have our Node API running, and same with the databases and the Redis servers. There we go. So that's all started up. The next thing we're going to go over is how to connect to these Redis and Postgres services. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is we want to add a connection URL into our environment variables. So right where we have them here, we're going to add a database URL and a Redis URL, and this is just going to be a connection string to the database. So for our local Postgres, we're going to make it equal to Postgres, and then the username is Postgres and the password is Postgres as we set up in the Docker container. And then we're going to do @Postgres, because this is going to target the service on the Docker container that we named it Postgres. So that targets this service here. Then we're going to select the port and then the database name. So I'm just going to call this Postgres for now. I'm not sure why Copilot did foodie there. But next thing we're going to basically just do the same for the Redis URL. So we're going to do Redis. Now we didn't set a username and password for Redis, so we can ignore that for now. We want to select the Redis service and then the right port. Okay, so now that we have these environment variables set up, let's go into our config and let's just add the database for that and Redis connection for that. There we go. Okay, so now that we've got the connection URIs set up in our environment variables, we're going to make some files in the libs folder. We're going to add a new file for Redis, and we're going to add a new file for database. Okay, so for the database, what I'm going to be using is I'm going to be using an npm package called pg for connecting to Postgres. So I'm going to do pnpm install pg. Once that's installed, I'm going to then import pool from pg, and then I'm going to import the config, and then I'm going to write const database is equal to new pool with the connection string config.db. Then we're just going to export default the database, like so. Right. Now you can see that we are missing some type declarations, so let's do pnpm i-d types pg to install those. And now when we want to connect to the database, we can just sort of do database.query, and we can run like a select all from users or whatever there. We'll be going over that in the next lesson. Okay, so now let's write out the connection script for the Redis. So for the Redis, we're going to be using an npm package called Redis. So we're going to do pnpm i Redis. Once that's installed, we're then going to import the create client from Redis. Then we're going to import the config, and we're going to export const the subscriber, which is going to create a client on the URL of the config.redis we set up. And we're also going to make a publisher, which is just going to duplicate that subscriber instance. Once we've done that, we now have the connection script set up for the database and our Redis. When we start the application, we want to make sure that the pub sub is connected. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a new function called start. It's going to be an async function. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we await for the subscriber .connect. And we're also going to do the same thing for the publisher, like so. Once we've done that, we can then run this app.listen. And then once we start the app, we're just going to start that start function, which will then run this, await for the connections for the pub sub, and then start listening for the port. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to do docker compose build. I'm going to build it, install all of the extra npm packages that we added. And then once that's been built, I'm just going to run docker compose up to make sure that that's all connecting and that's all fine. Okay, so it looks like that's all running fine. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up some base unit tests. We're going to be using Jest for this, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be using Jest, so we're going to install some npm packages. So pnpm i, and all of these don't need to be installed in the main dependencies, they can be installed as dev dependencies. So the first thing we're going to install is Jest. Then we're going to add the types for Jest. And then we're going to add ts Jest to convert our TypeScript into JavaScript while the tests are running. Okay, so first we're going to install those. Once that's done, we're then going to add a jest config file to the root of our file. So we're going to add a new file, and we're going to say jest.config.js. Once we have that, we're then going to paste in this config. So what it's doing is it's setting the preset to tsjest, it's setting the test environment to node, and then it's looking for all of the ts files to use the ts preset. Then we're going to match any files that is .test or .spec, and then we're going to ignore anything in the node modules. So once we have that, we're then going to make our first test file. So for this, we're going to just add it into the roots for now. So we're going to add a new file and we're going to do auth.test.ts. So this will be our first test file. Now I'm going to do a describe, and we're going to say example test, and then we should say it should pass. And then at the moment, we're just going to basically pass in a dummy test, so it expects 1 to equal 1. Now this is just going to obviously always pass, but it's going to make sure that our tests are running. So to run these tests, we want to add in our package.json, under the test, we want to change this to run jest, and we're going to run in band. And this just means that the tests will run after each other rather than all at the same time. And we want to do this because we're working with a database, so we're going to be wanting to delete the tables, re-add the tables for each test so that we're starting from a clean state each time. So now that we have this, I'm just going to run pnpm test to ensure that that test is now running. So as you can see, we have the test passing on the roots auth.test, and it's passing, and one's passed, all done. Okay, so that's the base of our test setup. Next, we need to set up some database migrations because we want to have some database tables so that we can use the database in our tests. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a migrations folder. And this is just going to live in the root. So we're going to create a new folder called migrations. Once we've done this, I'm going to use an npm package, so pnpm i-d to install into the dev dependencies. And the npm package that I'm going to use to manage my migrations is node pg migrate, like so. So once that's been installed, we're then going to add our first migration. So how we do that is we're going to type in npx node pg migrate create. Then we're going to give the file a name. So we're just going to add user table as the name. Then the migration folder that we're going to use is migrations, like so. Once you run that, it's going to create a migration script. So within this, we have our migration script. So as you can see, we have an up and down function exported. So this is what happens when the migration is ran up. So we want to do pmg.createTable users. We're going to give it an ID. The type is going to be serial, and it's going to be the primary key. Then we just add in all of the stuff that we might want the user to have. So we might have a username, which will be a varchar 255, and unique. Then we might have a name, varchar 255, and then so on and so on. At the moment, we're just going to leave it at this. We might create a created at date, just so that we can automatically track when these are created, like so. And then you can use these pgm.functions to pass in like current timestamp and other things that you can find on the docs. Okay, so once we have that, we can then close out this function, like so. And then on the down, so when we want to roll back this migration, what do we want it to do? Well, in this case, because we're creating the table, we can just drop the table. So we can just drop the table like this. Okay, so how do we run these migrations? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the package.json and we're going to create a migrate script. So we're going to call it migrate, and then we're going to run node pg migrate up -m to pull from the migrations folder. And because all of these migrations have a timestamp prepended to it, then it's going to automatically know which one's been added, which one hasn't been added, and it'll automatically track that in a migrations table so that we don't have to worry about picking the right one, or when we want to rolling back the right one, and so on. We also don't need to worry too much about running the migrations more than once, because if the table has already been created and that migration has already been ran, it would just ignore that migration. So in the dev script, what we're going to do is we have this concurrently tsc nodemon. Before that happens, I just want to run the pnpm run migrate function. So it will migrate and then it will do this. So it will migrate all of our databases up and then it will start running the server. For our production start script, what I like to do is I like to install pnpm i-d npm run all. Now this is an npm package which can run the scripts one after another. So what I like to do here is I like to create a start production script, which will just be this node dist index.js. And then in the start script, what we can do is we can do run-f. Then we want it to migrate and then start production. So now this will run the migrate and then it will run start production afterwards. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's just do a docker compose build. And then once that's been built, let's do docker compose up, and we should see that the migration will then run. So now that we have our migrations running on the dev, and we also have it running in production, what we want to do is we also want to make sure that these migrations are ran on our test scripts. That way we have all of the same databases when we're wanting to write some unit tests for inserting users, removing users, that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to install an npm package, so pnpm i-d, and then this one is going to be at databases/pgtest, like so. Once we have that done, we then want to go into our jest.config.js, and we want to add a global setup and global teardown. So let's add a global setup, and this is going to equal to the node modules at databases at pgtest/jest/global setup. Then we're going to do a global teardown, which is going to do basically the same thing, but instead of running global setup, we'll do global teardown. And what this is going to do is it's going to set up and tear down the databases when our tests run and finish. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure in our package.json we set some config up for the Postgres in the test environment, like so, to set a migration script. And this should be migration script. Then, once we have that, we can just pass in the commands we want it to run. So we want it to run npm run migrate, which will run this migrate function here to migrate the scripts. Now that we have this, in our test that we wrote earlier, if we wanted to connect to the database, we do that within the functions because we would do database.query. So what we would want to do is after all of the tests in this have finished, so we do after all, we want to run an async function, which would then just pull in the database.end, making sure we import that database from our libs folder db. Then, if we're, for example, we're working with the users table, after each of the tests, we want to delete all of the information we add into the users table. So we want to do await database.query delete all from users. Because say if we have a test which is creating a user and then making sure we can authenticate that user, because this is the auth test, we then want to make sure by the time it gets to the next test, we want to start from a blank slate. So you can see that we're deleting all from users here, which is basically just selecting the users table that we created earlier and deleting all of the records within it. Okay, so now that we have this, let's make sure that when we run pnpm test, it starts up our test server for the Postgres database and also tears it down again. So let's do pnpm test. So So you can see here what it did is it started a Docker container for the PG test, and it waited for that container to become active. Once it was active, it ran the migrations, and then it passed the test. It also set up the string for our environment variable for database URL. And that will override the environment variable that we set up here. So for our tests, it's going to connect to the test database that is set up. So now that we have the databases set up locally, we've got some base unit tests written out. We've got the database migrating in all environments, which is local, development, and production. And we've got the test running and successfully passing. The next thing I'm going to go over is hosting the service. Now, when it comes to hosting your service, there's an abundance of tools out there which will help you do that. A couple of them are Railway, which is very popular, and a new one which is hop.io. Hop.io is really nice because it allows you to configure private gateways between your service and your database. But just for the simplicity of this tutorial and going with what is commonly popular nowadays, we're going to go with Railway. Now, of course, you could build up your own DevOps system with AWS, but that requires a lot of knowledge, and maybe in the future I will release a series which will go over building all of that from scratch, but for now we're just going to go with Railway. Now, Railway will handle all of that for you, so all you need to do is deploy with GitHub and add some services to it, and you're done. So what I did before this section is I created a GitHub repository, which is public, so you can go ahead and you can fork it, or you can make a pull request, or you can add issues to it. It's under the helping develop /fullstack server repo, and helping develop is just what this YouTube channel used to be called, so I just popped it there. Another thing I did is, what I forgot to do is I forgot to add in the moving the migrations folder into the Docker file. So you can see here that I've added this line here, which is where I've just copied the migrations folder to the migrations within the working directory on the Docker container. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's create a new project on Railway. I'm just going to deploy from a GitHub repo, and I'm going to select from that helping develop repo that I had earlier. Okay, and then I'm going to add some variables. So the variables that I'm going to add, so you can see that it's suggested some variables here. This is because we have that .env.development file in the repo. So I'm going to just change a couple of these. So I'm going to add them all first. And I'm going to change the node environment to be production. I'm going to change the port, and I'm just going to remove that altogether because the port has already been automatically added from Railway. Then I'm going to leave the Redis URL and database URL as it is for now, because we need to create those. So let's go to the deployments and let's cancel this deployment for now, because that's going to fail because those database URLs are incorrect. Let's create a new service for a database, and let's select Postgres. That's going to automatically spin up a Postgres service. So while it's doing that, let's create a new service for a database and Redis. Once we have the Postgres set up, you can see that if we go into the connect, we automatically are given the available variables. So we can see it here, we can copy this, and we can paste this into our variables for the database URL. Like so. And we can do the same thing for Redis. Like that. Now that that's been done, and we have the new variables set up, let's now redeploy and spin up the service. So something about Railway is that you won't have private networks configured for you. Now, I know that this is coming soon to Railway, and they're going to be changing slightly how the databases are run. So it's going to change to basically you're going to deploy a Docker image, which will be a Postgres or Redis. And then you can set up a private internal network between this and your server. But for this part of the tutorial and at this time, this isn't available. So if we go back to our Fullstack server, you can see that the deployment has been completed. If we view the logs, then what's happened is it's built everything that we needed from the Docker container, it's installed all of the npm packages, it's copied all of the migrations over, and it's published the image. Now it hasn't done anything after that because we haven't set the start script. So if we go into the settings, we can then change a couple of things here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to generate a free domain from Railway. So if we generate, it will give us this free domain, and you can also add a custom domain to your service. Then, if we scroll down, we might want to give this a better name. So let's just call this Node API and click Save. Then we're just going to set up the start command to be pnpm start. If we wanted to scale out this service to be on multiple instances, then we just put in the amount of replicas that we need here. At the moment, by default, it's 1, but we could have this out for 2. Once you've set your start command, let's just press the tick. Now, this is going to automatically redeploy and schedule a redeployment in the deployment section. So if we go to the deployments, you should see anytime now a new one pops in. If we view the logs, then we can just see how this is getting along. Now, once that redeployment has been published, we can move over to the deployment logs and check out its deployment progress, because now that we've added in that start script, it can move over to deploying. So you can see that first it's going to run the migrate, which is going to run the PG migrate in the migrations, and you can see it's automatically added that table. You can now see that we have all of our servers listening on the ports. Now, the reason why we have so many here is because if you remember in production, we set it up so that if we go to our index.ts, we set it up that it clusters on every one of the CPUs that is available to us. Only in development will it limit this to 1. So that's why we have so many instances running. But this is what we want. We can now go to the settings and open up this domain that they gave us. And you can see that we have cannot get. This is because we don't have a root set up on our base URL. But we do have an API v1 auth setup, which is auth true, and user setup, which is user name John Doe. So now you can see that we have automatic deployments set up with Railway so that when we commit to our GitHub repository, they're automatically going to redeploy. With Railway, you can also set up a staging environment where you can fork the production environment to a staging environment. You could then also set up in the settings to deploy from a staging branch on GitHub. This would be really handy when you want to run tests and you don't want it to go automatically out into production. You want to be merging things into a different branch, making PRs, and then once you're happy, you can merge into the main branch, which will be deployed to production. Another thing that's nice with Railway is that for your Postgres instance, they'll automatically give you a visual representation of the data in Postgres. So you can see that we have this users table, and then within the users table, we currently have nothing, but you can see the fields that we added in our migration script. You can also add columns and even create tables from here. So this is really nice, and you don't need to install pgadmin or something that you may want to do on hop.io. In the future, I think that we will be going over making a private network between your server and these instances. Whether it's going to be on Railway using the service itself, or whether we're going to add like a Tailscale instance into our Docker container, which will then configure the private network. That's up to us and in the future, depending on how quickly Railway gets that feature out. You can also set it up as is today with hop.io, and that's a very simple way to do it. It's a very like click and play setup with private networks, and it automatically makes gateways for you and stuff. So if you want to reach out in the Discord, I'll be happy to help you set up that stuff. To conclude, in this lesson we set up the Redis and Postgres service for local development in our Docker Compose. We then made the base Jest setup and ran some unit tests. We learned how to connect to the database through the unit tests with a test database, and we set up a migration script for handling databases and data migrations on a production environment. We then went over to Railway and we set up the host for the service and the databases, and I'll leave a link in the description for the repo that we made so that you can go over there, clone it if you need to, and check it out. In the next lesson, we'll be going over making the user functionality, so create user, delete user, that sort of thing. And we'll also be going over the authentication endpoints, handling auth tokens and refresh tokens for the service. After we've done that, we'll be writing out the unit tests to ensure that all of this works fine, and we'll be setting up a GitHub workflow so that on our commits we can automatically test and ensure things are not broken before deploying. We'll then set up a staging environment on Railway and lock our production environment to the main branch to ensure that a test pass before allowing deployments to go out in production. After this, we're going to probably switch to a front-end project to start piecing things together. So don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and join the Discord for any extra help. I've also started streaming on Twitch most days, so feel free to come along and join in there.